Very good, you got one. Okay, I think we should get started. Could you please take your seats? Hello, can you please calm down a bit? We're going to start the session. So welcome to this plenary session entitled Trade and Sustainability. Where are we? Can we get there? My name is Matthias Helble. I'm a senior economist at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. And I'm very pleased to chair and moderate this session today. Let me first introduce our distinguished panelists. To my left is Arancha González, who is the Executive Director of the International Trade Center. Then we have Aiko Lim, who is the Director of the Trade Environment Division at the WTO. To my right, we have Joseph Francois, who is the Managing Director and Professor of Economics at the World Trade Institute. And we have Gregoire Garsous, who is a trade analyst in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD. So the title of this session is Trade and Sustainability. Where are we? Can we get there? And we would like to understand sustainability in a very broad sense, in a sense that's also enshrined in the SDGs. And last year, Ben Shepherd and I, we have gathered some trade economists to look at this topic of trade and SDGs, and we put together a book called Win-Win, How International Trade Can Help Meet the SDGs, and I just use this opportunity to promote this book also. But in this book, we clearly show that trade is related to a lot of SDGs and is also mentioned in the SDGs as a means of implementation. And while in this book we try to really lay down the main linkages, the book also raises a lot of questions because, of course, trade can be a very powerful tool to generate economic growth, but also there are a lot of risks associated with trade opening, and the question is how can we manage these risks to really have at the end a situation that can be described as win-win, where we have a trade opening, more trade, but also where we can achieve the SDGs. But let me now turn to our panelists, and I will first start with Arancha, then go to Joe, and then Ho, and finally Gregoire. Arancha, I would like to ask you about the SMEs, because ITC is very active in helping SMEs to get into the international marketplace. And as we all know, SMEs are the backbone of every economy in this world. They provide a lot of jobs. So I would like to have your view in how far SMEs have actually been successful in reaping the benefits of international trade, and what can we do? What are the remaining challenges in terms of getting SMEs into the world economy?
Well, thank you very much. I'm not an economist, so first that disclaimer, I will not give you lots of econometric analysis. That's not my lens. I will give you a bit of what I see happening at the political level. Where is the center of gravity for those that have to regulate, trying to understand how the sustainability dimension fits into their landscape. And before I jump into the SMEs, maybe I will start a little bit above that. When Bernard invited me here last year, my starting point was that in the 20th century, trade was about producers and compatibility. And in the 21st century, trade is more about consumers and sustainability. Since he didn't contradict me, and since he's invited me again, I guess this premise still holds. So if this premise holds, that trade in the 21st century is more about consumers and sustainability, I want to zoom in a little bit into what that means. And I will start with what frames this debate from a political point of view, called the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I know that the SDGs are not very popular with the trade policy community because they did not participate a lot in the elaboration of these SDGs. But the fact of the matter is that this is the lens through which governments are more and more working and developing policies. So what do these SDGs say for the purposes of this discussion? SDG 12, it's about ensuring sustainable production and consumption. SDG 8 is about decent work for all women and men and equal pay for work of equal value. It also talks about protecting labor rights. It also talks about helping small and medium enterprises, that's in number 8 also, participate more in international trade. So the lens through which governments are looking at trade more and more is trade, what I call trade with adjectives. And the two adjectives that they use throughout these SDGs are sustainability and inclusiveness. So some data to frame the discussion on sustainability. 2015 Nielsen Consumer Survey. 2/3 of respondents to this survey say they are willing to pay more for sustainable products and services. And this is also the case for consumers in emerging markets that are profoundly changing their consumption behavior. How are producers, businesses responding to this? Here, a bit of a shout out for the report we will be releasing on Monday. It's ITC's State of Sustainable Markets report, where we zoom in voluntary sustainability standards in agricultural products. 10-fold increase in the area of land certified to voluntary sustainability standards. So the amount of land in agriculture that is being cultivated with a sustainability dimension in mind has increased tenfold. Early next year, we are going to do the same exercise together with DG Trade, European Commission, across sectors. But the preliminary data we have, it already points at an even bigger increase. So what we see is producers responding to this consumption by aligning to what consumers want. Let me add another dimension to this discussion. UK Modern Slavery Act 2015. Very important piece of work. It's legislation to eliminate slavery work, so to speak. And it has a clause that affects the way value chains are going to work, saying big businesses will be forced to make public their efforts to stop the use of slave labor in their supply chains. Now, fourth example, public procurement, more and more initiatives at the national and local level that are putting adjectives around buying for public purposes. Why am I bringing all these examples to the table? Is because it shows that whether we like it or not, whether we find it makes economic sense or not, whether this creates externalities or not, the fact of the matter is that it is more and more about trade with adjectives. That was sustainability, inclusiveness. And I want to now go to your SME question, Matthias. If I look at trade agreements in the 90s compared to trade agreements today, the number of agreements that now talk about SMEs, they don't necessarily have actionable clauses, but they talk about SMEs, has moved from 6% to 25%. The number of trade agreements that mention women's economic empowerment, another dimension of inclusiveness, from 14 to 47%. So, in my view, all of this must lead all of us to ask ourselves the question, how will we deal with what I could see as being a problem in this debate, which is the proliferation of standards, the difference in those standards, the divergence in these standards, or the fact that some countries do not simply have the ability to regulate and therefore will always be catching up towards those that create the standards. So disparity, divergence, as well as ability to match those standards are two issues that I think we need to consider for this space that will be will become more and more part of the trade policy makers' landscape.
Can I just follow up? You mentioned the aspect of gender, and SDG 5 is about gender. ITC has been very active in promoting women as entrepreneurs. I think you have a Trade and Women program. Can you maybe tell us a bit more about that and some success stories, but also maybe some challenges remaining?
I think for the purposes of this discussion, which is a trade policy making discussion, our starting point was to look at the data and what the data tells us, and we've surveyed dozens of countries to get to this conclusion, is that out of 5 exporting companies, only 1 is a woman-owned, woman-managed exporter, meaning women-owned businesses export less than men-owned businesses, although women-owned businesses represent around 40+% of all businesses around the world. So the question we have asked is, why is this? What are the factors that are limiting the ability of women to participate in international trade, understanding that if you don't participate in international trade, you're going to miss out a big opportunity to improve your competitiveness, and it is pretty likely that you will therefore be in the category of informal or very small business, which is why we thought we needed to care about this discussion. Among the factors that we have found affect the ability of women to participate in international trade, there are many that do not depend from the trade policy maker, access to finance, access to business network, social and societal behavior, land ownership, ownership rights. But there is also two that, in my view, matter for the purposes of the trade policy discussion. One is what kind of trade policies do we make, and how much do we analyze the impact of trade agreements on gender to shape those trade agreements. And the second one is data, which I should have mentioned before the analysis, because obviously if you don't have gender disaggregated data, the ability to incorporate this dimension into your trade policy making is not going to be very strong. So that's what we have found, and this is why we have been sponsoring the WTO looking, and WTO members looking more closely at this link between women and trade, which triggered the declaration that 120 members adopted ahead of the WTO ministerial last year, to understand better the link between women and trade policy, that is, because that's why the discussion is in WTO. So it's a space that has barely started, but in my view, it's generating a lot of interest, and it certainly it's allowing lots of countries that have done trade agreements with clauses in it on women and trade. Some of them, actually the leaders of these have been developing countries, are having an opportunity to share their views with the rest of the membership, which I think is extremely interesting.
Thank you very much. May I just ask you one more question? I'm now based in Asia, and I think in Asia, trade has been really working well to lift millions out of poverty, and not only in China, but also in a lot of other emerging economies. However, I think in some continents, for example in Africa, trade is still not working at its fullest to deliver on sustainable development. And I think earlier this month you've been to Zambia for a bigger ITC conference. Could you maybe share with us a little bit what's the reason? Why is trade not yet up to its potential in the case of Africa?
Well, I think we would need a lot of time to discuss this, but if I had to capture it in a nutshell, it's too fragmented and too unstructured. And these are two big constraints on getting trade to work in the African continent. I mean, you know, we could expand access to credit, structure of the SMEs, competitiveness of the SMEs, and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing for the purposes of this discussion is that the leaders in Africa have understood that their biggest untapped potential for them is within the African continent. And this is what has driven them to now embark on a process to integrate the African continent through the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Incidentally, next to the signature of this agreement, they also signed two other pieces of two other agreements that, in my view, are important complements to the Continental Free Trade Agreement, one on open skies and two on circulation of professionals, that at the end of the day give you a sense that they've understood what potential they have to decluster the very clusterized African countries into a continental-wide zone.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Joe. I mean, one recipe to use trade as a tool for development has been to integrate into regional or global value chains, and I think in a lot of Asian countries this has worked very well. Now, is this still kind of a mechanism to promote sustainable development, or is there kind of a trend that a lot of value added remains in developed countries, or what is your view on the role of value chains in promoting sustainable development?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, there was discussion before in the last plenary about the rapid growth that we've seen in trade up until the crisis, right? And I think it's becoming clear that that was tied to increased complexity in production, the deepening of intermediate parts networks and global value chains and regional value chains. So clearly it's an important part of the landscape. What that means in a development context is I think it acts as a multiplier in terms of the the benefits and the risks with being in the trading system or not. If you are able to integrate into a regional value chain, you're able to sort of leapfrog. You can take advantage of the global frontier on technology almost right away. It also means the cost of not doing that are higher. The network effects and the fact that we see sort of the self-reinforcing aspect of who supplies parts to who, once these relationships get set up, means that I think there's a greater risk of countries being left out as we see the growth. So one thing then is that I think when we worry about how trade may help development, some issues in terms of simple things like regulations and border costs, product standards, these things suddenly become more important because of the multipliers attached to taking part in value chains. Another aspect of that, though, and then with those, I think the trade facilitation agreement in the WTO is a step, but that system was designed not really for the world that we're in now, I'd say, for a number of reasons, but that's one of the aspects of the current economic landscape that I think the system doesn't reflect very well. There's been an effort in regional agreements to deal with some of this, but I think for the benefit of the countries with less leverage and negotiating power, it's important that this be multilateral. Another implication on that is that, and we've heard again in the previous plenary, most trade and most lobbying, it turns out, is really big firms. And that also means, and I think that's been reinforced by the importance of value chains and coordinating production along these lines, which raises kind of a cross-border problem with competition policy and regulation. Right? We have companies that are bigger than countries. And related to that, and about a third of us, I'll confess I've been one of them, during all of this, we sit and look at our computer screens. These devices reflect lots of two-way trade in parts and components. They also reflect interlocking patents. Okay, and we've had history with this in the past, motor vehicles, sewing machines, telephones, whatever. What that means, though, so we saw between Google buying some phone manufacturers' patents, and then Microsoft and Apple and Samsung, is they dance around each other and sue over who owns what IP. If you're not one of those guys, you're going to have a hard time getting into the market to produce these products. And as products become not just more dependent on cross-border production that's managed by massive firms, but as those firms are parts of sort of agreements to share and pool IP, if you're outside that pool, I think that raises a set of questions we haven't thought enough about in terms of developing countries. We have seen China manage to sort of muscle its way in to some extent, but that model won't work, especially for smaller countries. And so we really have to ask this question about getting access to technology, so not just getting into value chains, but the technology that's tied to those and who controls the rents to those. So on the value chain side, that's it.
Okay, let me now turn to the question of environmental sustainability, and we have seen the commitments made by developed and developing countries to lower the carbon emissions in the Paris Accord. And of course, one key question is our trade policy coherent with our environmental policies, and can we continue on the current path? This is a path that leads to the carbon emissions that we're aiming for. So, Joe, you also have done some research on this question of this coherency between trade and environmental policy. So, what is your take?
Okay. Again, so this morning we heard lawyers apologize that they weren't economists. So I'm an economist. I will apologize, and I'm not a lawyer for this one. Though first, on the value chain part, we have challenges that we didn't think about when we set up initial commitments, say, in Kyoto and then now in Paris as well. So a German motor vehicle, say, contains steel from Poland that involves inputs or metal or ingots and stuff brought from China. And so you've got coal being burned in China that shows up in a car in Germany. The difference between the carbon embodied in products versus what what happens inside borders raises questions about how we manage this. And I'll say, for example, I know from the Swiss data that in terms of the old targets, Switzerland's done quite well in terms of becoming more green. and emissions within Switzerland are down. But if you look at the carbon embodied in what the Swiss consume, they've outsourced it. Okay, it's gone up consistently. So that raises one set of questions about how we manage this stuff, what kinds of policy instruments we can use. And that, I think, bumps into what we're allowed to do or not with the WTO as it's currently set up. Right. And I hang out with Peter van den Bosche when he's not doing panel work in Geneva. Talking about this, it's, there's some clarification in some areas. There might be some space to argue that there's a chapeau on environment that you can appeal to. But I think we're going to have to develop types of instruments, taxes and subsidies, both for innovation but also for just responsibility for carbon consumed, that are not going to be consistent or that will be challenged in Geneva, that will be challenged within regional agreements. And so I think there is a need, even if we set all the all the old round stuff that's frozen aside, I think there's a need to sit down and talk about this. What do we think we might need to do? Can we come up with contingencies to allow for that? And indeed, in terms of subsidies for, say, energy and innovation and so on, can we pool efforts somehow? Can we come up with a structure to do that as well? Related to that, and something that's not in the WTO for various reasons in terms of enforcement of, say, investment provisions, but we have the government in Spain being sued by every renewable energy company that went in there in the 2000s because of changes in policy and ISDS. Okay, so some way to ensure consistency and flexibility on climate policy so that governments can change their minds if we think that we maybe have other ways to do things, getting rid of nuclear or whatever it is. Because otherwise I think there will be more pushback and reaction if that is not somehow sorted out. Related to that, we have had WTO cases. Two that come to mind is Canada with renewable energy subsidies and India with solar subsidies, where you have stated objectives that on the one hand look like they're environmentally friendly, but they end up having domestic content or protection elements in them as well. And so back to that idea of negotiation, some idea of coming up with what's allowed and what's not. Right. So in a sense, if you're going to subsidize solar, it shouldn't matter where it comes from. You've got U.S. states that subsidize solar if the stuff is made in the state. It's not. It probably even violates the Interstate Commerce Clause, let alone WTO provisions. Okay. And so I think seriously having a discussion about what the policy side and the instrument side of Paris is. What do we do? What are we going to have to do? And how do we agree that we can do this so that we don't get our firms suing each other? Is something that has to be dealt with. So.
Thank you very much. So you alluded to the fact that the WTO might be the place where people sit together. I think next week you're going to have an event on this topic of trade and environment and launch a new publication with UNEP. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about the latest on this trade and environment nexus, and do these two fields now come together? Do you see some convergence?
Well, thanks very much, Matthias, and thanks very much for the invitation to come here and to join you in this panel. Yes, we are having some activities next week. Thanks for the free advertisement. And so for those of you who are coming to the WTO Public Forum, we'll have a special segment where the Executive Director of UN Environment and my Director General will host a discussion on making trade work for environment, prosperity, and resilience. So for that particular event, we have a joint publication with UN Environment. And maybe I take a step back a bit about what you were just asking about, the narrative or the discourse or understanding, if you like, on trade and environment. I think the first thing to just say, and it may not be so well known, is that the principle of sustainable development is already enshrined in the founding agreement of the WTO. It's on the first paragraph, the first page. So the objectives of the organization, or the objectives of its members, if you like, align towards achieving sustainable development. And why this event? Why now? It's been a series of discussions and dialogues that have been going on. It's not a new thing. WTO has had many different collaborations with UN Environment. But this particular one, I think, is particularly important because I think in the discourse on environment, or even in the discourse on trade in general, there's a greater realization that a healthy environment is the foundation. It's essential to building prosperous and resilient economies. And we can't really get away from that, and we would not want to get away from that. So it's a fundamental building block. And so this event is to put a focus and spotlight on this, okay? And more concretely, I think there was talk earlier about how environmental objectives are assuming greater importance, and more than just assuming, you see them even in WTO notifications, in WTO trade notifications, and we keep a database on this. 20 years ago, it was about 1 in 10 notifications may have an environmental objective or consideration. Today, we see it's about 1 in 6 notifications have this sort of environmental objective. And our data is a little bit old. Our data is like 2016, 2017. And we see the trend continuing. So it's there. I mean, governments are taking action. They are regulating. They're taking measures in support of environmental objectives. And here, just a very small point. I don't want to overdo this point, but just to say that in the main, when these notifications come into the WTO and the rising number of notifications with environment-related objectives, you do not see a sudden rush or sudden emergence of trade disputes emerging at the WTO. We do have trade disputes, but they are rather small in comparison to the number of notifications we get in with environmental-related objectives. So it's, I think, important to just have that little perspective. And lastly, on just to say a little bit on the publication, I can come back to it more if you like. But I think that the main point of the publication is essentially to make this point that that trade can help tackle environmental challenges. At the same time, there are concerns on trade that we must also address. Trade is like any economic activity, will have environmental impact. But at the same time, trade is a very important instrument for how we allocate resources, how we produce, and how we consume. So it has to be an understanding as to how do we actually mitigate some of these impacts of trade. So that's also part of the focus. And just very quickly on what are some of these ways in which trade can help. And some of this will be well known to you since many of you are economists, so I'm probably telling you things you already know well. But things such as lowering the costs of transition, support diversification, ensuring more dissemination of environmental technologies by reducing costs, supporting global value chains. And some of this can be as simple as removing tariffs. Some of it requires more work into getting into non-tariff barriers. And that, of course, is a very important area, but it's an area that we would need to work more on. Subsidies has already been raised on several occasions. At WTO right now, it's been going on for some time. The effort to actually achieve SDG 14.6 on the removal of subsidies in line with those that are necessary to eliminate and to prohibit illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. So that's a very concrete target that the negotiators are working on with a timeline that they've given themselves. I won't stress timelines. We know that they don't always get respected, but the main point is that there's lots of active work on this. Some members, it's not all, but some members have also targeted fossil fuel subsidy reform as something that they feel as being very important. This came up in the Buenos Aires Ministerial Conference, where they came together to have a declaration on fossil fuel subsidy reform. These are some things that we touch upon in the report. At the same time, at the event next week is on 2nd October, some members will be organizing their own sessions on these topics. So I can come and speak more if you like, but I thought I'd leave it like that.
Thank you very much. Let me follow up with this topic on fisheries subsidies, because I think it's a very important topic, and it seems to be a low-hanging fruit from an outsider perspective to get rid of these subsidies. And I think the timeline is to have an agreement by next year. Do you think it's possible to have something on the table, and how would it look like?
Well, I'm the eternal optimist. That's why I have a job in trade and environment. So I do believe it should be possible, but and here's the big but, is that it requires a lot of political will. I mean, it's not an obvious low-hanging fruit as some people would think. It seems obvious that you would not want to subsidize illegal fishing, but when the negotiators get into it, the concept of legality and illegality becomes much more complex. Similarly with regulated and unregulated, some markets are not regulated. Some markets feel that it's somehow unfair on them to take on board certain disciplines in a situation where they are totally unregulated because of development concerns or development capacity. So as we go into each of these concepts, the negotiators do find challenging discussions, but on the other hand, that's the case with nearly every trade negotiation. No trade negotiation is easy. Currently, they are working very hard. There's just been a whole week of discussions on fishery subsidies, split up into different so-called incubator groups, looking at different parts of a potential tax on elimination of these types of subsidies. But the critical ingredient, as always, is that do we get the sort of political direction to conclude, or the negotiators get it? The good news, I would say, is that it's one area where you have the U.S. fully engaged. Whatever else you may read about the press on U.S. and WTO, in fishery subsidies, they are there. Their negotiators are working and working very hard to try to get a conclusion.
Okay, thank you very much for this update. Let me ask you one more question, because before you became director of the Trade and Environment Division, you worked in services, and I think services are a bit overlooked. We always look at the environmental goods, but actually services can make a very important contribution to sustainable development. If you think of health services or also educational services, would you like to give us some views on this?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, the services dimension to how it can help SDGs, I think is something, as you say, maybe it's a little bit overlooked. And the whole range of services, as you've already said, from health, education, or environmental, it's an area where trade policy could play a big role, if not already. Let's start with, say, environmental. Tariffs on environmental goods remain important, but they're not necessarily that high on each and every good. Like, say, wind turbines or parts of wind turbines, they are on average about 6% or so. It's quite high compared to other tariffs. But when you look at services trade restrictiveness is actually even much more, I would say, but it's quite hard to get a sort of tariff equivalent for some services trade restrictions. But they're quite an important chunk. And even if you look at the industry, when you come to looking at, for instance, solar panels, about 60% of a solar panel purchase is really linked to installation services. And if you look at the industry as a whole, environmental services make up about 60% of the environmental industry in most countries. And being able to use environmental services to effectively deploy technology is an area where I think trade policy could play quite an important role. And this comes to very basic things, having the installers, the people to repair, the people to monitor, etc. A wind turbine is made up of some 8,000 different component parts. They don't just all come together. You need to install it in place, and when you install it in place, you need that capacity, and that capacity basically means services again. So if a country has say, very low tariffs on wind turbines, but has really heavy services restrictions, which makes it impossible to bring some of these services into the country, it's going to be quite hard to make use of that type of technology.
But so do you see any appetite by WTO members to open up their services sectors? What is your take?
Appetite. I think it's been one of these stories that have been going up and down with the roller coaster of the Doha round, because you can't look at services in at least in the WTO in isolation from what's been going on in the Doha round. Now, trying to look at it delinked from Doha round, I would say yes, you do see services as one sort of area where you do see coalitions forming between developing countries. However, if you put those coalitions back into the Doha round context, they don't always work, because there's other linkages that they're making to other subjects in the Doha round. But as a topic, as a subject of importance, at least when I was working in services, you do see very broad groupings and coalitions of countries who say that this is one area which is of great interest to us. Of course, where the differences come sometimes is which sectors, which modes of supply. Is it mode 3, mode 4, mode 1, financial services, or is it more professional services? But that's all part of the negotiation. What's important is that people see that they have some need and some value, and then hopefully the negotiations can work out a package.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn to Gregoire from OECD. I think OECD has done a lot of work in this area of trade and sustainability. You told me you're just working now on a study estimating the embodied carbon emissions in trade. I think that's a very important task to do, to see what carbon emissions are actually in these goods. Could you tell us a bit more about that, and what are your main results, but also the challenges in estimating this the content?
Thanks. So exactly what we do at the OECD is estimating the total amount of carbon emissions that are embedded in the final consumption of a given country, of a given industry in a given country. So these emissions are sometimes called consumption-based emissions, or as opposed to production-based emissions, or carbon footprint, which is, I'm sure, a concept that many of you are familiar with. So when one produces goods for final consumption, one generally emits emissions in foreign countries and domestically. And so what our model allows us to do is to separate those two types of emissions and to calculate the emissions that were imported through the imports of goods that are eventually consumed by one given industry in one given country. And so that is what we call emissions embedded in trade. So we do that for 35 industries in 64 countries plus the rest of the world, and our time window is 1995, the year 1995 to 2015, so we have a 20-year time window. So how do we do that? I'll have a few words about the methodology. We use an international input-output model. So it is called the inter-country input-output model of the OECD. It's a model that has been developed for years, even maybe decades at the OECD. And basically what it is, it's a big input-output matrix that describes the structure of the world economy, no less than that. So it describes basically the interlinkages that one given industry in one given country has with all other industries in all other countries. And so to make sure to produce one unit of output in this given industry, we observe all the input requirements in all other industries in all other countries. And so once we have all this information for all countries, for all industries, and for all these years, and subject, to some matrix manipulation and some computation, what we can do is to decompose the global value chain of final goods. the goods for final consumption, and to identify all the segments of production of those goods. So foreign segments of productions and domestic segments of productions. And then the last step of our procedure is to match, is to take the data on carbon emissions from the International Energy Agency and to match these data to our model and to calculate the amount of emissions that were generated in each of these production segments along the value chain. And so once we have that, we just sum all these emissions, and what we obtain is the total amount of emissions that is associated with the final demand in one given industry in one given country. Yeah, so shall I continue with the results?
Yes.
Okay. So the results, what everybody's waiting for. I want to flag here that these are preliminary results. We're still finalizing the report, so they may be changed, and please don't quote me on that, but wait for the release of the report, which should be released in January next year, early. Carbon emissions embodied in trade have been increasing over time in both absolute values and as a share of global emissions, which is perhaps not too surprising given that, well, since 1995 at least, countries have participating more and more in the global value chain. As a result of that, they have traded more goods, intermediaries, and final products, and well, therefore, they also traded more emissions. The carbon emissions embodied in trade accounts for 20% of global emissions, at least in the latest year of observation, 20%. So for me, it's a very funny number because it's a big number. It's definitely non-negligible. It's a big amount of emissions. But it also means that 80% of emissions are produced domestically for goods that are consumed domestically. And so, all right, I don't know exactly what to do with that. I'd let you think about the implications, but it's probably has some implications. Embodied carbon emissions are not concentrated in a limited number of countries. I should nuance that point. Yes, China is the main exporter of carbon emissions, and it represents 22% of all embodied carbon emissions in trade. So it's definitely the single top exporter of carbon emissions. But then, and maybe surprisingly, the rest of emissions are more or less equally distributed across countries. So there is no other country that stands out as a big exporter of carbon emissions. And so what can also explain this number for China is its size. Obviously, I mean, the size of its economy can explain why it's a very big exporter of carbon emissions. And then the last result, which is for me the most interesting, is that the basket of imports from non-OECD countries to OECD countries is more carbon intensive than OECD's domestic production. So on average, when I import something from non-OECD countries, the carbon intensity of this product is more intense than what I'm produced and consumed domestically in OECD countries. So that suggests, and I say suggests, a pattern of specialization. More carbon intensive goods could be produced in non-OECD countries and then shipped to OECD countries. However, and that's a very big however, and I think this is the most remarkable result that we have, the carbon intensity of this basket is declining over time, and substantially declining. And this is so holding the composition of this basket of import constant. So it's not a composition effect, rather it is a technology effect. And well, we run quite a lot of tests about that, and I mean, again, wait for the final report, but this is, in my sense, a quite remarkable result. That is that non-OECD countries have become less and less carbon intensive due to technology improvements. And we see a clear convergence to OECD standards. We're not there yet. There's still a gap in terms of carbon intensity. Non-OECD countries are still more carbon intensive. But the decline has been continuous and very substantial over the years of observation. So, yeah.
Very interesting study. But do you think this could feed into these arguments to implement some border carbon adjustment? Because this is exactly the numbers that people are waiting for to say, yeah, we need some border adjustments for imports from China, for example.
Right.
What's your take?
I will answer that question, but I would like to take a step back before. I need to also flag the limitations of the study, which are quite important, sorry. So the study that we've been carrying out is only for carbon emissions from fuel combustion. So we do not include international freight, which is an important part of global emissions. We do not include direct emissions, direct carbon emissions from industrial processes. For instance, when you produce aluminum or cement, you have carbon emissions from fuel combustion, but also from the industrial process itself that it's being released in the atmosphere, and that we do not take into account. We also exclude other types of greenhouse gas emissions, especially the ones from agriculture, such as methane and nitrous oxide. So, well, once we will be able to include all that, maybe the results will change a little bit. But so, for carbon emissions from fuel combustion, this is what we have. Okay, now regarding the carbon adjustment issue, I think that what this kind of study highlights is the benefits and the costs of such measures. Well, let's start with the benefits. I think, as I said, that, okay, 20% of carbon emissions are embedded in trade. This is a non-negligible number, and, well, it tends to point that there is scope for regulation, and maybe some of these emissions could be abated through regulation, and why not through trade regulation. However, as I just said, the carbon intensity from non-OECD countries to OECD countries, I mean the carbon intensity of the basket of imports from non-OECD country to OECD country seems to be converging to OECD standards, or at least it's less and less carbon intensive. So in this perspective, technology plays a very, very big role, as the results suggest, and maybe one other way or one alternative to carbon adjustment would be clean technology diffusion. I'm sure that if the same good can be produced in a very clean way in OECD countries, why not cannot be produced in the very same way elsewhere? So that's for the benefits. Now, for the costs, what this exercise probably points out is, well, the implementation costs of a measure such as carbon adjustment. As I said, we did this exercise for 35 industries, which is like very big. So we have big average of, carbon intensity for these industries. This is definitely not very accurate. And in my sense, ideally, a BCA or a carbon adjustment measure should be, well, down at the product level. And I can't imagine that we can measure the carbon content of all products that would be shipped across the world. So I'm really concerned about the implementation costs of a measure such as carbon adjustment.
Thank you very much, Greg. So we have about 10 minutes left. Bernard, do you want to finish late? I guess not, huh? Okay. Okay. So maybe quickly, is there any reaction from the panelists to what was said? Otherwise, I will open the floor. Okay, so I will open the floor for questions, comments. So please raise your arm. Any questions, comments? Yes.
Yeah. Again, my name is Shen-Kun Lu. I'm from China as a professor. Now, a quick question to Gregoire about what you said. I mean, one thing, you said that China accounts for 22% of export emissions, and because of its size. I mean, do you look at the other side of the picture? So where does this export go mainly? I mean, who are importing them? And did you also look at the consumption part? So who are consuming mostly? I mean, be it China exports or other exports in terms of carbon emission? Thank you very much.
I personally did not look at it, but Joe apparently has an answer. So
Yeah, we've been doing a similar exercise, and it goes to Europe, it goes to North America. So China, on the consumption side, the carbon intensity of the Chinese economy is much lower than it is on the production side. And the flip side is true with the high-income countries. But yeah.
Was another question here?
Yeah, Andreas Freitag, Friedrich Schiller University, Jena, Germany. I have a general political economy question. Thinking about trade policy in relation to the environmental or social problems mentioned on the panel, and thinking about Tinbergen, how can we, in Tinbergen's law, that we should have one policy tool for one policy objective? How can we make sure that this debate is not going in the direction that, along the lines you just mentioned, that there's a trade policy measure which is too costly to be effective?
I'll give it a try. Ilaria, are you still here? No. So we have this project that's running. We're also looking at the legal dimensions of implementing these things. Except for the U.S., just about everybody else has a VAT, right? And with the VAT, there is an accounting system where you track moving forward from firm to firm. Piggybacking on that in terms of carbon credits and moving those forward, and then since you already have statements of value that, I mean, it's not as hard as we think, again, except for the U.S. that doesn't have the VAT, and they've been talking about it, right, in terms of having, they call it something differently, but as a way to tax carbon in production. I don't think it's as impossible as we think. I do think it bumps up against tax treaties and against provisions of how we tax things through what we're allowed to do at the border in the WTO. But I wouldn't assume that it's impossible, especially if it's necessary. But, yeah.
Can I say something about it? So I remember a few years ago I was given a dispute. You know, I was part of this project of the ALI where they will pair a lawyer and an economist to look at disputes. And one was involving India and additional duties on alcohol, but there were implications for carbon taxation. I remember discussing with my lawyer and Petros. My impression, but here maybe the lawyers can, is that the current WTO rules wouldn't allow for some of this carbon adjustment that you are thinking of. And so you would need a new, an Article 20 is very limited what you can do. So maybe, we can have a deeper discussion about that. But I agree with the principle of targeting. In principle, you should not use trade policy for...
Are there any other questions? I guess everybody's looking forward to having a...
More than a question, I would like clarification from Gregoire. If I understood correctly, you said that 20% of the carbon emissions are embodied in the goods that are traded. Is that correct? But then a few minutes after you said that you were not taking into consideration trade. So that confused me totally.
Sorry, I didn't say that I didn't.
Trade and agriculture will not.
No, agriculture. No, so greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, such as methane.
That's you're not considering.
No.
But of course, everything that has to do with trade, yes.
Sorry?
when you say that 20% of the emissions are originated in trade, in traded goods, embodied in goods that are traded, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's straight.
Yeah, that's so 20% of global emissions are traded across countries. If you want it that way.
Okay.
Of carbon emissions from fuel combustion.
Okay. And 22% of that 20% is originated in China. Is
Yes.
that the point?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not to jump in, but we had also a very interesting seminar in WTO by a professor from Yale who was doing this sort of work, mapping out carbon globally and looking at how carbon is being transmitted through global value chains and trade. And I think that the one thing that he said, which is not to contradict Gregoire or anything that he's come up with, but his point was a fairly simple one, which was that yes, you see a lot of products that are traded, and the carbon embodied in these products are being traded, and they come from particular countries, say from China. But it's basically to feed consumption in Europe and in North America, essentially. So it is a sort of integrated network that is going on. So they are producing, but they're producing to fuel the consumption happening in these other countries. So it was quite interesting because his point was that, you know, where should the carbon adjustment actually be? Should it be on the source, on the producers, or should it be on the consumers, the ones who are actually consuming? On whom should these taxes be levied upon? So he didn't really answer that question, but I think it adds another dimension to this debate. That was all.
Thank you very much. If there are no other intervention, then I will bring this plenary session to a close. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I think that's been a very interesting panel discussion. Thank you very much.